everybody, and welcome to I'm a Fan of That, where, I guess, do we still talk about fandom through objects, or are we just talking about fandoms that we love at this point?
I think we attempt to keep the premise going sometimes, but mostly we're just talking about fandoms that we love and the reasons we love them at this point.
Yeah.
I think like 4 seasons in, we have sort of let go of the original bit. But
yeah.
We're still here, we're still doing it. It's okay. We try, we attempt to.
We'll do our best, but that's, yes. So we're going to be talking about fandoms and fandoms that we love and why we love them and what we learn about our love for them. And today we're talking about a sitcom?
Yeah, I would call it. It's definitely a sitcom, yeah.
Yeah, a sitcom known as New Girl. I am a recent watcher of New Girl. So I think we started watching it like 6 months ago, a year ago. Somewhere in there.
Okay, so you're really new. Really
yeah,
new.
Really new. And I know that a lot of other people are somewhat relatively new to it, in the sense that I think over the pandemic, quite a lot of people started kind of binging it because it was on Netflix, and what else are you doing during the pandemic other than binging Netflix shows?
That was what we did. So I think we watched it all. I can't remember if it was over the pandemic or whether it was just after, but we watched all of it, like literally all of it, in a matter of, it was the thing like, oh, should we put an episode on while we're having lunch or dinner or whatever, because there was nothing to do. There was nothing to do. And I think you get to a point where, particularly if you remember lockdown number 2 over the Christmas period where we were all going in 2020 to 2021, I'm pretty sure it was around then that we really, really got into it, because in the first lockdown we watched all of Schitt's Creek. That I distinctly remember, was watching all of that, which is also an excellent TV show. So, there was a lot of stuff that I watched over lockdown that I probably should have watched sooner. But yeah, New Girl was interesting. New Girl is interesting because I both really enjoyed it and also have so many criticisms of this show while watching it, which is really interesting because normally that's something that kind of comes later. Like, I've watched all of Friends and I have a lot of criticisms of Friends after the fact, but watching New Girl, I was like, I am enjoying this, but I am also frustrated by this show, and I don't know why particularly it was so obvious to me, and maybe it was because my brain was bored and I was stuck inside the house the entire time.
Could be, and I'll be interested to talk to you about this because Tom and I got into a discussion about it at one point because we disagree on a particular character in the show.
Interesting.
As to whether or not the character is problematic. So I think that'll be a fun discussion to have as well.
I'm interested by the fact that it seems to be one of those, for people who don't know New Girl as a show, it is a sitcom, and it's sort of, it's the Zooey Deschanel quirky girl sitcom, essentially. That's the premise. New Girl she is Zooey Deschanel. She is called Jess, and she is a girl who moves into a flat apartment.
Yeah, it's like a loft apartment.
Like a loft apartment with a load of guys, because she's the quirky girl, which is the premise is I do find particularly a little bit frustrating, but at the same time it is very fun because they are really fun characters that have been created, and so it's not as irritating as it could be. It certainly is very much, I think it's of its era when it was written. Definitely it kind of feels peak millennial to me. That sounds awful, but it is very much sort of the peak Tumblr coded, a bit of I'm not like other girls, except Jess is very much a girl's girl if you kind of look at her as a character, actually.
Oh yeah, she's
not that I'm like other girls, even though that's clearly the setup, that she's living with a load of guys. But it's a really fun sitcom. I do recommend watching it, even if you get a bit frustrated with some of the characters, just because some of the stuff that happens is genuinely hilarious. And also, I mean, Nick is so funny. How far have you got just before I start?
Oh no, I've seen the whole thing.
Okay, cool. Because
yeah.
Spoilers, I am probably in the team. I do not think Jess and Nick should have got together because I think they're quite bad for each other. But that's not how sitcoms work, right? It's the same as How I Met Your Mother. It's like, why? Why did you do that ending? That's so bad. But, like, that's just how sitcoms work. They have the couple they want to get together at the end, and so they Friends does it as well with Rachel and Ross. It just, you got to tie it up with a neat bow, and so you do end it like that. But yeah, so that's the premise. It's Zooey Deschanel's character, Jess, living in this studio loft apartment with Nick, who I've forgotten, Schmidt?
Yes.
And then...
It starts with Coach.
Yes, and then it switches to... Oh my god, I've forgotten his name. I had Coach. Winston, thank you. To be fair, it's been a while, and Winston is... all of the characters are so fun, and... Winston's brilliant. I think he's a really fun character. I think he's a really lovely, really well-written, really fun character. And Schmidt is interesting. There's also Jess's friend who comes and goes, who's like a supermodel.
Yes.
Who's quite interesting. and various kind of friends and family who interact with them, as is the way with sitcoms around the core group. You know, you have your 5, I would say. Cece, that's her name.
Yeah.
You have Jess, her friend Cece, and then the 3 guys, and Coach comes back in every so often, and then they have other people who they interact with. And that's the setup. They live in this apartment together, and they have shenanigans. The shenanigans of late 20s, early 30s people.
Yes, I was about to say, I think a really important element is that the vast majority of the characters are, for the most of the show, in their early 30s. And
they
I
are
think...
grown-ups.
Yeah, they are adults, and I think that is a really interesting point to focus on, because I think often in sitcoms you get, at least starting in the sitcom, you get really young, so you get like the early to mid 20s.
Yeah, Friends,
or you get older, and it's really nice to capture that kind of weird point in your 30s where you're starting to realize that you don't actually know what you're doing, but you're supposed to be an adult that does know what they're doing, and you don't really know how to handle that.
And the joy of the show as well is that all of these characters are weirdly at very different stages of their lives. So Schmidt has a really good job, but he's living with his friends because he's a man-child. Essentially, he doesn't want to grow up and have his own apartment and things. He's living with his friends because he still wants to be young and a kid and all this sort of stuff, even though he has money. Nick is literally a wreck. He's a creative, and he works in the arts, and so he's broke all the time, and he clearly has ADHD and can't cope with the world in a way that the others can. Jess is a teacher, and I think, is she getting her teaching degree during the first series?
She's a full-on teacher. Later she starts going into the more administrative side, so she starts becoming like a principal and stuff, which isn't actually how it works, but we'll put that aside. Yeah.
And then Winston seems to he's kind of the one who's sort of in and out of jobs a lot as well with Nick. To start with, he's doing, oh my goodness.
He was a professional basketball player.
Yes, this is the problem.
In Latvia.
Yes. So the problem I always had is that, like, the first series they had Coach, and then they changed with very little fanfare, by the way, to Winston. Because of I think something happened with the actors, so there was no real changeover in the show. And so for the first 2 series, I got their storylines, because I was like, wait, that was what was happening in series 1, and this is what's happening in series 2, and I used to get muddled up with which character had which storyline, particularly when you also had Nick, who was just all over the place. And so I literally was like, you've changed the actor and the character and not told me what's going on, and my brain got very annoyed by that. I do also think that the show kind of did that thing of like, oh, he's just another black guy. That's fine, it's just another black guy. Which just isn't fair to the characters or the actors that they didn't actually announce they were doing any of this, or have a moment in the show where they were,
to explain for people, the Coach was in the pilot, so the very first episode, Coach is in it as the character, but it's the pilot, and things often change between the pilot and the actual pickup of the season. It's not abnormal to see different people, different actors in the first episode versus the second, because that's just how it often works. And so Winston was in the second episode onward. But they didn't just say, oh, there is no Coach. It was a very throwaway line, but they said that Coach actually had moved somewhere else and was doing this other thing. And Winston, who had been living with them before he went off to Latvia, came back to live with them.
Series.
No, it's only the
I'm
first episode.
misremembering that. Okay.
Yeah. So that's why I was trying to explain it. So they do mention it, and Winston, when he first arrives, has a very different kind of personality.
Yeah,
and
as well, which is very strange.
Which is also different than Coach. They didn't just
Yeah.
insert him as Coach, which was nice, but I don't think they had really figured out how Winston worked. And then as soon as the actor and the writers kind of find the feet for Winston, he really blossoms as his own kind of strange individual character. There's
mid-series 2, series 3, he really starts becoming this really... He's so funny. He's so funny.
There are episodes where, like, in the kind of strange Winston kind of during that series that you get the little snippets of, like, oh, this episode is probably what helped them figure out it later on because of the way he was acting. It felt like the new Winston when it kind of comes in. And so it is kind of takes a while for Winston to find his feet, but that tends to happen for a lot of the characters. They kind of settle. Some of them are very caricature-y that then become more human as the episodes go on, which is nice. Jess, they do that for. Schmidt, they do that for. And
Nick
then
is the only one who I think just remains.
Gets a bit weirder. Yeah.
He just gets worse. But it's interesting because it genuinely, and obviously I was watching it during lockdown, so it was quite a long time ago, and in a slightly odd headspace, as I think we can all agree, literally the show, the first series, I was like, why am I still watching this? Because I think it didn't really click until series 2. The beginning of series 2, all the characters really start clicking together, and I think that's why it feels very odd when you think back and be like, oh, there was another character who just wasn't there. And it, again, like, all the stuff I remember of Winston is like series 3 onwards when he becomes so entertainingly strange, and like I just can think of him like in that corridor where he's like sort of dancing and putting a shoe on, like it's so strange, and he's so funny. And particularly once they get the bar location. So as we said, this show, I feel like we're going around we're jumping all over the place for people who don't know what the show is. To start with, a lot of it is set in their apartment because they're broke and they don't have jobs, or they do, but they're spending all their money on rent and all this, late 20s stuff of living in a big city when you're co-living as well, and it's a lot of those problems. And then I think it's about series 3, Nick starts working in a bar, and so they all just start going there. And so you end up with... Okay, you've watched it more recently than me.
Yeah. So basically the main set pieces that they have is, from the beginning, the bar and the loft are the kind of primary locations. He has always been working at the bar. It's not until series 3 that they actually start to co-own the bar. So the owner sells Nick a portion of the bar in order to he needs a bit of money. So him and Schmidt go in together to buy 10% of a bar, and then they start acting like it's their bar and they have all this say and sway and they can do all this stuff, and really they only own jointly 10% of the bar.
I think when you watch something in very, like, you're literally watching it in a block at a period of time, and this is something I kind of want to talk about when you binge watch stuff, is it all becomes very muddled, and you go, when did that happen? Who was this? And you kind of stop realizing. Whereas, like, I'd be really interested to hear your opinion on this. When I've watched things where it's been once a week and I've been watching it as it goes, that I have a better memory of the story. And I'm very good at remembering stories in TV shows anyway, but, like, I think that when you binge watch it, things get squished and truncated, and you suddenly think, oh yeah, that was all happening at once, or oh, that happened later, and in fact it happened much earlier, because you've got that kind of binge watching brain. Whereas, like, when you do that weekly thing, and so you can almost tell when in your life you saw that episode to a greater or lesser extent, like, it becomes, I don't know, it's kind of, at least for me, I don't know if that's true for you, particularly when you think back on stuff that you maybe watched 5 years ago. Oh my god, it would have been 5 years ago I watched this show. No wonder I can't remember any of it.
It's really crazy to think about. For me, I think it depends on a couple of different factors, but I find that I have a harder time remembering, say, what season something happened in, but I will remember the story.
Yeah.
When it's, they don't all blend together, and I can kind of remember roughly which episode happens before which other episodes, but I might not know this was the cutoff of season 3 because we could just go straight into the next one I don't have to wait a whole year or whatever until the next season starts coming out like you would if you were watching it as it came out. But I will know the progression and the history of it a lot better. Tom's more like you, where it all kind of becomes muddled. And so he always finds it kind of fascinating because I'll do video essays on stuff that we've done. And so I'll like be trying to remember, oh, when was that scene? I think it was in season 2 probably because it was around this time. And Tom would be like, no, it would be season 4. And then we'd look it up and it was in season 2. And even though I it could have maybe been end of season 1 or beginning of season 3, like sometimes it's not quite, but it's never as far or even as early sometimes. Like he'll always get the timing way wrong because he's like you where it's all kind of muddled, while I'll remember roughly the progression a bit better. While if I watch a show as it comes out, I forget the details of things because I think it's because I consume so much stuff on a regular basis. So I am almost always in the middle of reading 3 books at a time. I listen to a shit ton of podcasts. I watch all the reality TV shows while also watching. Tom and I try to balance 3 to 4 TV shows at a time. So there's like, if we're only watching something as it comes out, there's probably about 8 to 20 other stories that are being inputted into my brain at the same time, like in between each episode. And so I'll just forget shit.
Because I find I also, I'm sure everyone realizes, consume a lot of media as well. But if I tend to watch ongoing things, and that's easier for me because I'll be like, on Wednesday, I watch this show. On Tuesday, I watch this show. And so I know when they're coming out, or roughly when they're coming out. And the same is true of my podcast. I know what day they're coming out. I know when they're going to be there. And so I can then be like, and I'm going to input that thing into my brain today, and therefore it stays there because it's a Tuesday. It's Tuesday, and on Tuesdays I watch this, and so I take in all the detail. And my God, am I autistic sometimes. Routine. But it's quite funny, and it's not even necessarily that, because like often me and my mum, we love Silent Witness. We've watched all of Silent Witness. I'm not even joking. All of it. From the 90s to now, we've watched all of it. Not in the 90s, we watched quite a lot of it over lockdown, but we have watched all of it. And the funniest part of that is because now it's on, we're now caught up, and so we're watching it weekly. I can tell you, I can remember the stories much, much better. However, I can still go, okay, so there was a thing back in this series, but I would have to go quite a long way back to... I wouldn't... The ones we watched in lockdown, in those binge watching things, I wouldn't be able to tell you what series they were in. I could tell you a story happened. Whereas the ones now, I'm like, oh no, the ones since we've started watching live, which would be like series 25, there's a lot of it. I can be like, oh, that was in this series and that was at this time. And I can tell you exactly what happened in the story because we watched it on Monday. It on a Monday, and so I can remember it. And I find that quite interesting, how different brains work. Anyway, back to New Girl.
I also tend to have a much better grasp of things, even if it's completely unrelated to it, if I've done a video essay on the topic. Yeah. So I did a video essay on New Girl. If people are interested, I centered it entirely on one episode, which is, I think, a season 1 episode called Injured, which is when Nick hurts his back. And he's taken to Jess's friend who's an OBGYN because Nick doesn't have insurance. So she agrees to look at him between patients, kind of off the books, gives him some pain meds. But then while he's there, she notices a lump on his lymph node, I think, that seems really like a problem and could be cancerous. And so she suggests that he goes and gets an ultrasound in order to actually check it to make sure that it isn't cancer. And so then it becomes, this entire episode is about that stress that you have before actually knowing. Like, there is that potential that something could be really bad, and you don't know, and you're kind of suddenly hit with it, especially when you're so young, in your late 20s, early 30s, when you're not really expecting to get that kind of news, but people get that news a lot at that age as well. So it's not abnormal, but it is possible. And it really and in that episode, you really see everybody's full character, I think, in a way that really encapsulates the whole story. So that's why I centered it on that. But even though I was centering it on just that one episode, because of the process of just doing it, I kind of was able to, so even though there's a lot of things that aren't connected to that video essay that I didn't even research or talk about, I'll remember things a lot clearer just because I wrote a video essay on it. So there is certain amounts of that also plays into things sometimes with me, and I make everything that I enjoy work, so it happens.
So if we're talking about New Girl as a sitcom, and I think everybody's watched a sitcom, and I think the concept of the sitcom is a really interesting part of the media landscape, because they are incredibly cheap to make, generally. Not always, but generally. They tend to be... The whole point is a sitcom is a situational comedy, so you tend to have maybe 3 set pieces max, particularly to start with. You're not necessarily going to have loads. New Girl is a really good example of this, in that the first series, like you said, you have the loft and you have the bar, and then you start adding in other places as the series progress. You start going to more people's apartments. Schmidt gets his own place after a while. Jess's work, all of that kind of stuff. You start seeing more and more of them as they clearly get more budget. Friends is also a great example of this. To start with, you really only have 3 set pieces in Friends, really. You have the 2 apartments, and then you have the coffee house, Central Perk, and sometimes Ross's place. But, that's kind of it. And they're all sets, right? Mm-hmm. And I find it quite interesting that sitcoms are something that doesn't really go out of fashion. You might have a slightly different style of sitcom. New Girl is a slightly more evolved style of sitcom than Friends, but they are essentially the same premise. A group of people who it opens with a new person, literally, Rachel and Jess both kind of coming into a situation with more established friendships, and that developing around that, as opposed to, I've mentioned Shit Creek. Shit Creek is more to do with the fact that the entire family have been transposed into a new situation and then coming to grips with it. But it's quite interesting how the sitcom still sits in the media landscape as something that people really enjoy. It's not become passé or anything, even though it very easily could have done, given the initial nature of sitcoms being, single camera on a living room set, kind of thing, where a husband and wife are having hijinks. It could very easy, and some of those ones are more, passé, but still, you have things like, for listeners in the UK will know Not Going Out, which is Lee Mack's long-running and honestly irritating sitcom, but people seem to love it. And also Mrs. Brown's Boys, which again I don't get, but again is very much that classic sitcom kind of setup of a family in a house with static cameras. And it's quite interesting that they have remained a thing in the world. And they might get more sophisticated in how they're made, the filming styles and all that kind of stuff, but they are still very definitely here.
Yeah, I think it's because it's a simplicity of topic. It's always really hard when you engage with a new piece of media and you want to share it with somebody and it's got this really convoluted pitch, and then you're sat there for 20 minutes trying to explain just the premise of the show, where with a sitcom it's woman moves into loft with 3 boys, there you go, that's it. Yeah. That's the premise. That's all you need to know. There's nothing else to it. And so it makes it really simple, and I think people always enjoy the simple premise because then all the complication can just come in the moment and not necessarily have to be... You can also jump in and out. There are storylines that progress through New Girl, but also not really at the same time. You can kind of jump in whenever and get the gist of what's going on, and you don't need to have caught up on the previous episode if you missed it, which is always nice, as opposed to those kind of long-running dramas where if you miss an episode and then you come in, you're like, wait, what is happening?
Yeah.
So that's always nice. But I think the updating comes in things like production. We were being told that if we liked New Girl, Two Broke Girls is a really good one to watch. So Tom gave it a try on his own because I wasn't sure, and immediately he was like, no, we're not watching that. It's got a laugh track.
Yeah.
And this is something that Friends obviously has, is the laugh track, and New Girl does not have the laugh track, and just that alone can really make it feel dated, and Tom always jokes around about how ones with laugh tracks always feel way less funny than ones without, just because it's like that forced laughter when it's like, but that wasn't funny. Well, like if New Girl, if you don't laugh at a joke, it doesn't tell you that that was a joke. You just keep going, because they also don't pause. That's the thing about New Girls. They don't pause between jokes at all. So sometimes if you're busy laughing at one, you'll kind of miss the punchline of a second one that like just came right after it. So, it doesn't have those moments of pause, which means that if you didn't catch the first joke, you're laughing at the second one, and you don't feel like that long pause of like, what?
Yeah. New Girl, I found most similar to one of my favourite sitcoms ever is Scrubs, which I am currently trying to find the new series of somewhere that I can watch it, because I want to see how how they've done the new version. Scrubs is just so interesting, and they really, again, it's one of those ones, they don't have a laugh track. They set you up with this very obvious scenario. These are new doctors. Hijinks, Yep. It's a very hijinks, tone scenario. And everyone loves a medical show. Obviously, The Pit is currently doing very, very well. And, I mean, Holby City, Casualty, ER, all of these shows have been on forever. And so again, people can go into that with an understanding and a premise. They get it, it's a pretty normal thing, but it also understands, like, and I think in the same way New Girl does in the episode you were talking about with Nick, where he thinks he might be unwell, is that it really understands the balance between like comedy and really poignant moments. Like it really, really gets that. And I think that's something as well that a lot of sitcoms, particularly when you move into the more modern era of sitcoms, I would say kind of your noughties, late noughties onwards, you really kind of go, oh, they're not just here to be like, funny joke, funny joke, funny joke, oh, laugh track. They kind of play more into that grown-up kind of element of it, I guess. And it's weird because Friends does start doing that to much, as it goes, but because it's set up with the laugh track, it doesn't quite hit in the same way. Whereas, like, the ones that haven't got that, you can lean into the drama side of it more, the emotional side of it more, without it feeling forced, I guess.
Yeah, or out of place. Yeah, I think one of the things that I did appreciate about New Girl was that sometimes they introduce these issues that then they just decide not to solve. I think a lot of times, and this kind of goes to the poignant thing you were talking about, is I think a lot of times sitcoms and more simple funny shows will try to be like, look, serious thing, and then they'll like fix it by the end of the 30-minute episode. And sometimes things don't have a clear answer and a clear result, and sometimes it's that character's personality is just that they are always going to be struggling with this thing, and that's just what it is. And they really didn't shy away from doing that in New Girl. And the one that I think of in particular is that Winston later on in the series becomes a cop, and as we mentioned in passing, Winston is a black man. And there is an episode where he's kind of having to talk about the fact that there is a very bad history between cops and the black community. And he kind of just ends the episode by being like, yeah, it's a complicated thing, and I'm not going to tell people that they're not allowed to feel this way. And I'm sometimes not sure how I feel about it. And that's just what it is. I'm going to do my best. That's all I can do. And that's where we're ending this. Yeah.
And it's interesting because you have it juxtaposed with things like Brooklyn Nine-Nine as well, where they really did, but towards the end, really lean into that, to the point that they ended the show because they were like, we can't do this show anymore because the situation is no longer one that we are comfortable writing about. And, I
had some problems with that, but...
Yeah, I don't necessarily agree with it, but I also am not American or a person of colour. So I feel like there are other people who can make better commentary on the show in general. There are propaganda shows, and we have to acknowledge that. No matter how much I love Jake Peralta,
One of the things that does annoy me, and this was at least the thing with New Girl, and I'd have to check the dates to be sure, but I'm pretty sure that was before the pandemic. Like, it shows, I think Shows like Brooklyn Nine-Nine, and I think often shows very much led by white writers and white communities, are often not realizing that things were a problem before that. You know, it's like the fact that they only realized that it's kind of cop propaganda when Black Lives Matter was happening is kind of already a bit. I know they had one episode a little bit before that with where Terry was racially profiled in his own neighborhood, but it was very kind of like, again, it wasn't very dealt with, and then it kind of moved on, and that can happen, and that's fine, but also to then not shut it down at that point, but then to shut it down later, it feels like you didn't really understand, you know. I think that was more of what my problem was. But can we quickly shift and talk about Schmidt?
Yes, absolutely. Let's talk about Schmidt.
Schmidt was the character that Tom and I got into an argument. We don't really argue, but we had a discussion about. So for people who have not seen the show, Schmidt is kind of introduced as, Holly very aptly described, as a kind of a man-child. He's outrightly douchey, and they use that word to describe him. He has a douche jar. Whenever he says something douchey, they make him put money in it, and they point out the fact that he's kind of a douche.
He sucks so much.
He sucks so much. And as the show goes on, he has moments of getting worse and he has moments of getting better. And it kind of ends with him being somewhat better. He's the one that has this love affair with Cece. Jess's best friend, Cece. Yeah. And they end up getting married and having a kid. And he's kind of the first one to fully actually settle down and have this life, while the other ones are still living in the loft and kind of figuring things out. There's a lot of conversation about Schmidt, and I have always found it interesting because to me it mirrors a lot of other conversation about very similar type characters in sitcoms in general. And I think particularly of Ron Swanson in Parks and Rec as an example of this, of characters that are presented to the audience as people that you are not supposed to like and are written that way. Characters react to them that way, and then people talk about it as being a problem. And with Ron Swanson, they had to shift it because people started to idolize him. While I think with Schmidt, it kind of reaches that thing of like, are we not allowed to have a problem character that then gets changed and represents a certain group of people and actually what might be going on with them, and how we can therefore change those people in society in order to make them not exist anymore? Or are we supposed to have everybody on a TV show be perfect, idealized characters?
Because the other character that Schmidt gets compared to a lot is Barney Stinson from How I Met Your Mother. Barney is infinitely worse.
Yeah, I was gonna say it's a very different thing.
Yes,
and
I think they kind of get put, because when you have those characters, they get put in the same bubble, even if they're not actually very similar. Because Schmidt is essentially, and this is one of the things about the show that I never quite agreed with, is that his storyline is that he was overweight. He was a person who grew up not, and then in inverted commas got hot as an adult. And I do find that a storyline problematic, even though it is often the way people see themselves and all that kind of stuff. And again, it's a storyline that a lot of shows have used. Friends did it as well with Monica. And it's quite a easy shorthand to be like, he got hot and so now he wants to get girls and all that kind of stuff. Essentially the premise is that he glowed up as an adult, and so he has kind of these problematic traits in his personality because of that. Because he's suddenly kind of got everything. He's got money, he's got the looks, all this kind of thing.
Well, I would... Because I think that I
think that's the premise the show are trying to put across. I'm not necessarily saying I agree with it.
I'm saying the opposite, actually. Because I think the show portrays him as deeply insecure. Yes. Deeply insecure.
But that's what I mean, is that what I mean, those traits come from him being insecure because
but in more than just, so obviously him being overweight before was an aspect of it, but I don't think it was the only aspect of it. They very early on, they have an episode where it's him and one of his friends who comes in and out, and he's like he's more of the Barney Stinson kind of douche, and the way he treats Schmidt is really poorly. And you see Schmidt just wanting to get this guy's approval and to be seen kind of similar to him and like him. And it's as he starts to realize that his friend is actually really terrible that he starts to detangle his own experiences. And there is an entire storyline where he actually goes back to dating his like first serious girlfriend that he had back when he was overweight. And they never talk about her weight. But as an actress, they picked an actress that is not a supermodel size. She's gorgeous, but she isn't the kind of typical presentation. They obviously do it up a bit more, like they make her, the makeup that she wears is made to make it look like she's not wearing makeup, you know, like that kind of thing. And because obviously she's wearing makeup, but like they do it that way. And they have her wear a bit more of like, you know, kind of lazy clothes and big things that aren't very flattering. And he dates her very seriously for a while, even as not overweight when he comes back. And a lot of it is that particular relationship is kind of really reprogramming him in the way that he thinks about himself. And I think that the overweight aspect of it is a small part of it, but I think that the whole show is trying to show that he is deeply, deeply insecure and that he actually can change and he becomes better throughout the show. Yeah. But it's a slow process. It is not something that happens in one episode in 30 minutes. And I think it makes it much more realistic in that sense. And I think that it's one of those things where the show's portraying that he's not supposed to be a figure that you like right off the bat, but they also are showing him as very much complicated. He is not, it's not just, oh, he was fat and now he's hot and now he wants chicks. It is way more complicated than that. And I think that's what I wanted to kind of pinpoint, is that I think sometimes shows do only that bit. Yes. And this show does more than that bit. And I think that's what's really important, because in real life, that more than that bit is the reality of the situation.
I think the most comparable things to it are shows more like The Good Place, like where they spend a lot more time with characters detangling those issues. But the other one is BoJack Horseman, which is hard to call a sitcom because it's an animated series. It's a bit different. But BoJack Horseman also really understands and detangles those kind of character traits and takes a long time over them, to the point that, like, as a show, it's quite difficult to watch at points because it's taking time to get people and going through. And Schmidt's perfect at this, in that, in inverted commas, recovery isn't linear, right? So his time getting better and becoming a better person and learning about himself or whatever is not a linear thing. Like you said, he gets worse. There are points where there's a point where he's dating two women at once.
Yes. He is dating his original girlfriend, you know what I mean? And Cece at the same time.
Yeah. And, you know, he tries to justify it and all this sort of stuff. And actually, it is part of him learning to be a better person, because he has to go through this thing of like, I'm gonna do that. You know, he's almost kind of manic in it at points. It's quite interesting as a character. And I think the show, like I said, I think the premise when they set it up, probably in series 1, when they are kind of finding their feet, is that's the bit almost. But then they don't leave it as the bit. It's not just, you know, it's not shallow. Like you said, it's not just that. And I think that's part of the show in general. That it's not just shallow.
It's such an important difference when I talk about things, and this was kind of part of the discussion that I was having, is I was like, when you look at characters that are quote unquote problematic, to me it's more about how the show treats them. And to me, the show doesn't treat him as good, or as, they're treating him as a problem, and therefore it's not problematic, if that makes sense. Because they do kind of heal him.
Yeah. Like Ron, I love Ron Swanson. I love Parks and Rec. Again, a show that there are so many things I could say about, good and bad, because humans made it. But Ron Swanson is one of those characters that, to start with, you're like, I feel like you're right, you should hate him. You're like, oh my god, you suck. There are so many things about you that, like, if I met you in real life, I would never want to be around you. But what I find interesting is that Leslie, as a character, kind of shows us that we're meant to like him because she likes him in some way. She finds him infuriating, but she does like him. She does have time for him. And then obviously their friendship is one of the core elements of the show. You know, it is the two of them to the end kind of thing, despite all else. And I find that quite interesting that they did have to make such a big change with him, that had to have him change because people were like, yeah, but he's funny and he's entertaining. Whereas with Schmidt, it felt more... I mean, a lot of Parks and Rec doesn't feel very... And I love Parks and Rec, but it is a world where realism is pretending to be realism, but it's not at all. It's slightly out there. Whereas with New Girl, it's much more of a realistic take on how people change. It's not just people come into your lives and they're nice and you like them and so you become better, which, it's a very much an element of it, but it's people come into your lives and you change and you want to... Time, exactly. Because it is Jess coming into their life that makes all of these men change for essentially the better, but it takes 8 seasons. It doesn't, it's not something that happens at the end of season 1. And we say that Nick gets more weird, and I think that's because that's his better. If that makes sense, he leans into who he is. He is trying so desperately to be somebody else for a long time in the show that he is trying to be like the others. And then he's just not. And while I do definitely think that him and Jess probably shouldn't have ended up together because I don't think they're necessarily healthy for each other, but that's just sitcom logic, that of course they will. I think it is her showing him that she is very much herself that allows him to do that. But I also think there's a little bit of the Manic Pixie Dream Girl in there because Zooey Deschanel, and so, that's why I kind of feel like she can be there to help him, but maybe she shouldn't be the person who's forever there to help him. He does need to kind of get to that stage on his own. But it's interesting that is his story. It isn't he needs to become a quote-unquote normal grown-up. It's that he needs to become quote-unquote the grown-up he is. And that is a different type of grown-up to other people. And that's okay. That's fine.
Yeah, there's a really amazing arc for him because at the beginning, he always makes this joke about how he started writing a zombie novel. That's like the thing that he always heralds as like what I can do. And there's like a point where he goes, as a writer, and people are like, you're not a writer. You wrote the beginning of a zombie novel. Like that is all you have written. But then by the end of the series, he's a very famous, accomplished author. And it's one of those things where you see him actually having to lean into that weird side of I wrote half a zombie novel. That then becomes his personality and how he becomes successful.
And it's something I think a lot of creative people really are drawn to Nick, because that thing of being in your late 20s, early 30s, into your mid 30s by the end of the series, because Nick is a bit older. Nick's older, yeah. So I think by the time we get to the last series, which has a time skip as well, he must be 40. And he's just made it. He's made it. He's famous now. He's got his books coming out, all that stuff. But it's happened to him later in life because being creative and being a bit weird and being a bit strange and having to lean into that, while the world's telling you need to be a grown-up and get a job and pay your rent. And obviously you have to pay your rent. But all of those things... are difficult for people whose brains don't work like that to work around. He kind of sees, I think it's Jess because she's also really very strange, but the fact that she's found a place where she can be strange and being a teacher that works for her and being artistic and creative and doing that side of things, that helps him get there. And my big issue with the show is, as I said, is the fact that I do think it's men relying on a woman to make them better. That it does kind of feel like that at points, particularly with Nick and Jess, which is again part of my reason why I don't think they should end up together, is because it feels a bit like that will always be what their relationship is. But again, within the conceit of the show, her weirdness complements his weirdness, and they are able to be weird together, and that's also nice that you'll find someone who will understand that you're really strange. And your brain doesn't quite work the same way as other people, and you might buy a 10th of a bar, and you might eventually finish your zombie novel, but you're in it together and you're doing something very odd. And that's fine. You don't have to grow up and have a kid and buy your first apartment when you're 25 or whatever. You can do it a different way. And I think the show very much leans into that with those two characters. And it's a sitcom, so there are, like I said, bits where you kind of go, oh, okay. There's a lot of TV couples, so I'm like, you guys should not have ended up together. But the writers want them to, and so they will. But that is part of what I really enjoyed about it, was how very strange Nick is as a character. One day I'd like to have a show where a woman is allowed to be as strange as Nick, because while Jess is weird, she does still have a proper job proper job, and is a teacher and then becomes a principal and all that kind of stuff. And that's not to say people can't, but it would be nice to have a woman who can be as screwy as Nick is without it being a problem, because I don't think we've quite seen that yet.
Yeah, I think what was really groundbreaking about New Girl at the time was that it was the first time that the lead female was the quirky friend.
Yeah.
If that show had been made in the normal way, it actually would have led Cece, who is the supermodel moving to LA and trying to make it as a model, and she's got this quirky best friend, and that would be the show. And instead it follows the quirky best friend who happens to have a supermodel friend.
Yeah. And I think also, like, it's interesting because I feel New Girl gets caught up in this kind of 2010s thing of the Manic Pixie Dream Girl, and there is a Zooey Deschanel era, let's be fair, of that kind of character. And so I think it gets tarred with that brush of like, oh, it's just another one of those things. Whereas actually it was one of the first of those things. Yeah. So it set the trend, rather than it being it's another Manic Pixie Dream Girl coming in to help a quirky guy or whatever. It's almost the OG of that. And that's also not her role, because it's not a film and it's not like a one-off series. Jess isn't just there to help the guy. It's her show. She is the lead, you know. Yeah. Which I think a lot of the copycats or versions that came after didn't necessarily quite understand either. They kind of did the quirky girl helps the guy, rather than the quirky girl is here and the guys are also here. You know, she's leading the story. It's her story, and they happen to be revolving around her, you know. So it's quite interesting that people didn't necessarily remember that about it.
No, it's that problem that I think a lot of people have with either stories or formats or anything like that they really enjoy, is that they'll kind of they look at things on like the surface level of the narrative of there is this character, that character, these personality types set in this place. We can just copy these things and paste it over there and it makes it work. And narratives are so much more complicated than that. And you have to look at what things are actually doing to the story. We talked about this off camera together at one point about how some people talk about like, oh, well, that's not doing anything for the story. But what they mean is the plot. Yeah. And that the plot is different than the story. And there are things that serve the story that isn't involved in any way in the plot. But without it, it would be a completely different feel to the story, because you need those elements because they do something, even if you don't see what it is in the actual action of the plot.
Yeah, it's interesting because so at the moment I am currently in the very early days of adapting Dracula into a stage show for my theatre company that I am part of. And it's very interesting when you're doing something like that, like what you take out, because obviously Dracula is quite long and you have to put it into a performance that people want to sit through. And in the scripts I found so far, a lot of what gets taken out are elements that I personally am like, why would you take that bit out? Because what it does is, it's still the same plot, but they ignore very important elements of the story to do with relationships between the characters. And that inherently changes the story. And I think you're right. So in this situation, if you just take the premise of quirky girl living with guys and move it into another setting and remove all of the elements of their personalities and their chemistry and the interpersonal stuff that they have, it stops being New Girl and is just, another Manic Pixie Dream Girl story.
Yeah, whereas, it's kind of like what we were talking about with Schmidt, where it's like you have the kind of base section of like, oh, this type of character, but then there's all this other depth to it, which again has nothing to do with the plot. But it's a further understanding of his character that actually makes him make sense in the story and makes him an important, in my opinion, non-problematic character, because it shows him as a problem. Yeah.
Yeah, and the thing is understanding that he has a problem that makes him unproblematic. And I think this is the thing people forget, is that, firstly, characters can be problematic because humans tend to be.
That's really what makes stories interesting.
Yeah. And so if you remove those elements of those relationships, whether it's in Dracula, if you remove the depth of feeling between Mina and Jonathan, which they almost always do, and I don't really understand why. Like, why? Anyway, it's because everyone wants Dracula to be sexy, and he's not. He's horrible. They just wanted to be like, sexy. No. Tut, tut, tut. But in something like this, if you remove the depth of Schmidt, he just becomes a dickhead who got hot for whatever reason that is and got money and therefore wants all the girls. That character sucks. That's Barney Stinson. And Barney Stinson sucks, you know?
And I think there was a really interesting episode that I think could have been done slightly better, but I understand where they were coming from, where Nick is dating a lawyer, and she has a problem with Jess, and she really doesn't like Jess. And it finally kind of comes to a head where it's kind of because she says, oh, I see your shtick, that you're this Manic Pixie Dream Girl, and you do all these crazy, quirky things, and, you know, that's not... Basically, it was kind of being like, but I'm a woman, and I work this job, and I'm this strong, independent woman type, and that's my type of woman. And, you know, she kind of has to say, like, yeah, but also, like, this is just who I am, and I'm not putting something on. I'm not trying to do anything. This is just who my personality is, and maybe you should just accept the fact that there are different types of women. And I think that the conversation that they had, I think, was a bit stilted, and I wonder if it's because at the time, directly talking about feminism and particularly internalized misogyny is really... it's a very complicated discussion no matter when you're having it, but it's definitely not something that you can have very easily in 2010 or whatever it was that this aired. Yeah. And so I do wonder if it was done now, if that conversation would be slightly different. But it is a really fascinating conversation in regards to the Manic Pixie Dream Girl, particularly around Zooey Deschanel, because there is always that wonder to me that I'm like, or is that just Zooey Deschanel? And then it was altered in this very strange kind of way where it works in one instance and it's kind of created in this kind of other kind of distorted view over here, and it creates this whole thing, but it makes it feel like sometimes women can't do that anymore.
And I think it also, I do very much think it is just Zooey Deschanel as a person. I mean, obviously I don't know her, but it does seem to be that is what she's like. But there's also a lot of us out there, not to put myself in the woman category, because I'm not, but I
socialized female,
grew up in that space. And when you're kind of neurodivergent and socialized female, a lot of people put you into that category of quirky, manic pixie dream girl, and you're just like, this is just who I am. This is just who I am as a person. And you're putting me in that box, and you're thinking it's a bit, or that it's like a personality I've developed. No, or like on purpose,
or like a ploy.
Yeah, and it's like, no, I'm just like this, you know. And interestingly, as I've kind of transitioned into more of a non-binary transmasculine space, into a place where I do sit more comfortably in the masculine, people are much less likely to do that to you. They just kind of go, you're a weirdie. You're so weird. We love the weird. It's a cool thing, and they don't make those assumptions in the same way, which it goes to show you patriarchy. That's all it is. And I find it very funny that I get very different reactions from people to my oddities, shall we say, as a person, now that I'm very much presenting and living in a different space in a different way than when I was as a teen and in my early 20s. So it is interesting that very much is kind of part of it, that they go, we could just put the quirky girl idea into a new show and that'll work. And then it becomes a stereotype, and it becomes something that doesn't make sense, because it's not a character like Jess where she's just like, this is just who I am. It's somebody who is writing the ploy, in inverted commas, kind of idea, because that's what they think it is. And I think that's quite interesting. But yeah, I should probably go and rewatch it all. I watched a couple of episodes before we did this just to remind myself of it all, and I was like, oh yeah, this is fun.
It is fun.
But I also want to rewatch Scrubs, so maybe I'll tell you if that aged well at all. This has been fun. I'm enjoying. I liked our discussion of sitcoms. I'm enjoying that. That's good times.
Yeah. I will link in the description. We didn't talk about too much, but I did bring up my video essay, so I'll link it because I am shameless like that.
Absolutely. You should. We'll also, if we have any links to where you can watch any of the shows we've mentioned, mostly they're on places like Netflix and Channel 4 and stuff like that.
I think New Girl right now specifically is on Disney Plus, at least in the UK. Obviously, it varies by country, so good luck finding it if you are somewhere else.
But we'll do a list of the shows we talked about if you are interested in any of them. Thank you so much for listening. We will be back with you very, very soon, where we will also talk nonsense about something else and how completely abandon the bit premise of the show, I think. You know.
Yay!
Yay! All right, guys. Goodbye. Remember to like, review, and subscribe. All of those wonderful things wherever you get your podcasts. And share us to your friends. Bye-bye.
Bye!